Japan, early 20th century. A nation caught between tradition and transformation. The cherry blossoms still bloomed in the ancient temples. Samurai legends were still told in quiet villages. But beyond that calm beauty, Japan was changing. Fast. Factories rose, armies marched, and an island nation began to dream of empire. At the heart of it all stood one man, Emperor Hirohito. To his people, he wasn't just a ruler. He was a living god, the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, a sacred being who carried the destiny of Japan itself. When Hirohito ascended the throne in 1926, he was young, intelligent, and curious about the modern world. He had studied biology, science, and even Western culture. But beneath his calm and polite image lay the weight of centuries, the belief that the emperor was divine and that his words shaped the fate of millions. The empire awakens. The Japan Hirohito inherited was hungry for power, for land, for recognition. The military believed Japan was destined to lead Asia. But in truth, this divine mission was driven by fear of being dominated by the Western world. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a vast region in northern China, rich in coal and resources. It was the first major act of aggression in Asia, and it happened under Hirohito's reign. Though he didn't give the direct military order, every major decision required his approval, and he approved it. The world condemned Japan. The League of Nations called the invasion illegal. Japan simply withdrew from the League and carried on. The emperor remained silent. That silence would define much of Hirohito's war years. He never shouted orders, never stood before troops, yet behind closed palace doors, his seal, his imperial approval, was placed on every major military action Japan took. A nation of loyalty and obedience, Japan in the 1930s was unlike any other place on earth. The people worshipped the emperor. His portrait hung in schools. His name was spoken with sacred reverence, and loyalty to him was absolute. The military used that devotion as fuel. Every soldier went into battle believing they fought for the divine will of the emperor. To die for him was not a tragedy. It was the highest honor. Propaganda filled the airwaves. Japan is the land of the gods. The emperor is our living deity. The world shall bow to the rising sun. Hirohito watched as his generals, men like Hideki Tojo, led Japan deeper into war. By 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China. Cities burned, millions suffered, and the world looked on in horror. Again, Hirohito did not stop it. He was cautious, perhaps fearful of losing control of his own military, but he also believed in Japan's mission to build a great Asian empire under his divine guidance, the emperor and the military machine. By the late 1930s, Japan had become a militarized empire. The military controlled the government, the economy, and the press. Hirohito remained the sacred symbol, untouchable and unquestioned. Behind the palace walls, however, the emperor received daily military briefings. He was informed of Japan's victories and defeats. He read reports of atrocities, but he rarely intervened. To the generals, Hirohito was both a blessing and a shield. They used his name to justify their wars. To the people, he was divine. To the world, he was distant, mysterious, the quiet god-king of the East. Storm clouds over the Pacific. By 1940, the world was once again at war. In Europe, Hitler's armies were conquering nations. In Asia, Japan saw its chance. That same year, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. It was an alliance that would soon plunge the world into the deadliest conflict in human history. Emperor Hirohito approved the alliance, believing it would strengthen Japan's position and protect its empire. But the United States saw it differently. Tensions between Washington and Tokyo grew. America placed embargoes on oil and steel, vital to Japan's war machine. Without these resources, Japan's empire would crumble. So the generals turned to a desperate plan, one that would change the course of history forever, a quiet decision for war. In the fall of 1941, Japanese leaders met in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the army minister, and senior naval officers all gathered to decide Japan's next move. Emperor Hirohito sat in his palace, quiet, reserved, listening carefully. He knew what they were planning, a surprise attack against the United States. The plan was bold and dangerous, to strike the US Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, destroy it, and Japan would control the Pacific. Hirohito hesitated. He understood the enormous risk. Japan was smaller, poorer, and weaker than America. But the military argued that Japan had no choice. Without resources, the empire would die. In late November 1941, the emperor gave his final approval. The wheels of war began to turn. The dawn of infamy. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft roared through the skies over Hawaii. In 2 hours, the US Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The world was in shock. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and so began the Pacific War, a brutal conflict that would stretch from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the islands of the Pacific. For Emperor Hirohito, the war was no longer a distant affair. It was now his war, fought in his name, under his banner. The rising sun had risen higher than ever before, but soon it would begin to fall. August 1945. The Empire of Japan stands on the edge of ruin. Once, its armies ruled across Asia. Now, its cities are burned, its navy lies at the bottom of the sea, and its people are starving. Inside the imperial palace in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito moves quietly from room to room. He is pale, weary, and withdrawn. For years, he has watched his country consumed by war. And now, the war is consuming him. Each morning, he receives reports from his generals. Each evening, he prays before the shrine of his ancestors. But the world outside those palace walls is collapsing. A dying empire. By mid-1945, Japan had lost nearly all of its conquered territories. American bombers roamed the skies at will. Factories were gone, transportation crippled, and millions were homeless. Still, the military clung to hope, or perhaps to delusion. They insisted Japan could fight one last glorious battle on home soil. They spoke of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice, the spirit of Bushido. But behind those words was only desperation. Emperor Hirohito knew the truth. The war could not be won, yet his generals refused to accept defeat. The emperor's divine authority had become a trap, a cage built from his own legend. If he spoke of surrender, it would shatter the myth that the emperor was infallible. And so he remained silent. The Americans' deadly secret. Thousands of miles away, in the deserts of New Mexico, a new kind of weapon had been born. The United States called it the atomic bomb, a device with the power to erase an entire city in a single flash. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Franklin Roosevelt's death, faced a terrible choice. Invade Japan and lose perhaps 1 million American lives, or use the bomb to force a quick end to the war. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Inside, a bomb nicknamed Little Boy was released. Hiroshima, the city of shadows. A blinding flash, a wave of heat hotter than the surface of the sun. Buildings vanished. People were turned to shadows burned into walls. In a moment, Hiroshima ceased to exist. An estimated 140,000 people would die, some instantly, others slowly from burns and radiation. The world had entered a new era of destruction. In Tokyo, Hirohito received the first reports. The palace officials struggled to describe what had happened. There were no words for such horror. Entire hospitals, entire families, gone in seconds. The emperor was silent, staring down at the paper in his hands. He whispered a single sentence. "This cannot continue." But before Japan could even understand what had happened in Hiroshima, a second bomb was on its way. Nagasaki, the second hell. On August 9th, 1945, a second American bomber, Boxcar, dropped the bomb called Fat Man on the city of Nagasaki. Another flash, another city destroyed, another 70,000 lives erased. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing Japan's last hope for negotiation. The message was clear. Japan stood alone, surrounded, and facing annihilation. The crisis in Tokyo. Inside the Imperial Palace, Japan's top leaders met for an emergency meeting known as the Imperial Conference. The atmosphere was tense. Generals shouting, ministers arguing, voices breaking. Some demanded one last battle to defend the homeland. Others, desperate and exhausted, begged the emperor to surrender. For hours, Hirohito listened. He rarely spoke, but when he did, every word was recorded by history. He said softly, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." It was a calm, almost poetic way of admitting defeat. But those words carried the weight of an empire. For the first time in Japan's history, the emperor himself would have to make the decision: peace or total destruction. The emperor decides. On August 14th, 1945, after days of debate, Hirohito finally made his choice. He summoned his ministers and told them what no Japanese ruler had ever said before: "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. I will endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable." With those words, the Emperor of Japan chose surrender, not just for himself, but for an entire nation raised to die in his name. The military was stunned. Some officers attempted a coup, trying to seize the palace and prevent Hirohito's surrender announcement. They failed. Loyal guards protected the emperor and the recording of his surrender speech, a fragile disc that held the voice of a god, the voice of the emperor. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the people of Japan gathered around their radios. For the first time in history, they would hear their emperor's voice. Hirohito's words were formal, distant, and full of sorrow. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he said, "We have resolved to pave the way for a great peace for all the generations to come, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." As his voice faded, millions of Japanese citizens wept. Some bowed to the ground. Others sat in stunned silence. The war was over. The Empire of Japan had fallen. The aftermath. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 people by the end of 1945. Entire generations were lost. The survivors, known as hibakusha, carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Hirohito, the once divine emperor, had watched his empire crumble under the weight of war and fire. He would soon face the American occupation and a new role that would forever change his identity. The god would become a man. The emperor of war would become a symbol of peace. The war is over. Japan is a nation in ruins, yet the spirit of its people endures. Amidst the rubble and the ashes, Emperor Hirohito walks quietly among the survivors, no longer a god in their eyes, but a man sharing their suffering, witnessing the cost of history firsthand. The emperor among his people. Hirohito understood that the myth of divinity had ended. He adapted, cautiously and deliberately, to a new role, symbol of the state, not ruler of an empire. He visited hospitals, inspected destroyed cities, and met with ordinary citizens. His presence was quiet, unassuming, yet profoundly symbolic. For many, seeing their emperor among them, human and vulnerable, helped them reconcile with the unimaginable losses of the war. The man who had overseen expansion, conquest, and destruction now became a living reminder that Japan could survive, rebuild, and evolve. Guiding Japan through reform. Under the watchful eye of the American occupation, Japan underwent sweeping reforms. A new constitution limited imperial power and enshrined democracy. Women gained the right to vote for the first time. Education shifted to emphasize peace, civic responsibility, and modern governance. Hirohito lent his quiet support. He encouraged acceptance of the reforms and emphasized the importance of national unity. He was no longer making war decisions, but he was shaping Japan's moral recovery. His public speeches were cautious, formal, and respectful. He never recaptured the awe of pre-war divinity, but he fostered a sense of stability, continuity, and hope. Living through history. For decades, Hirohito witnessed Japan transform from a devastated island nation to an economic powerhouse, from a militarized society to a model of peace and modernity, from isolation to engagement with the global community. Through it all, he remained a figure of continuity. His presence reminded the Japanese people of where they had come from and how far they had traveled. Even as he aged, Hirohito continued to visit disaster zones, scientific institutions, and schools. He became a patron of biology and marine science, reflecting his lifelong interest in nature and research, controversy, and debate. Historians continue to debate Hirohito's role in World War II. Was he a powerless figurehead, trapped by the military generals? Or was he a calculating sovereign who allowed atrocities to occur under his watch? There is evidence for both sides. He approved military actions and sanctions, yet he acted decisively to end the war when the survival of his people was at stake. Perhaps his legacy is not simple. Hirohito's story is not one of absolute heroism or villainy, but of complexity. A human ruler balancing duty, belief, and the unbearable weight of history. A nation transformed. By the time of his death in 1989, Japan had changed beyond recognition. Cities rebuilt, industry thriving, citizens living in peace, free from the fear that had defined Hirohito's early reign. A culture shaped by both tradition and modernity, remembering the past but striving for the future. From the age of empire to the age of democracy, from war to peace, from divine myth to human reality. The emperor's voice, once unheard, became a symbol of reflection and resilience. The man who had overseen Japan's darkest hours lived to see the nation rise again. Legacy of the Silent Emperor. Hirohito's story is a reminder that history is never simple. Power can be both a burden and a responsibility. Decisions made in silence can shape millions of lives. And even those who seem untouchable are still human, capable of both error and courage. The silent emperor remains one of history's most enigmatic figures. He led Japan through its rise, its fall, and its rebirth. And though the debate about his role will continue for generations, one truth is clear. Hirohito's life is inseparable from the history of Japan itself, a living testament to the cost of war, the necessity of peace, and the enduring strength of a nation.